Welcome back to the Expositor 99, your home for line-by-line Bible teaching, book reviews of relevant Christian books today and other books that clash with the Christian worldview relevant to it, and a deep scriptural analysis of topics affecting our world today. Today we return to our book review section, and we're going to be discussing a book within the apologetic sphere called Tactics, written by one Greg Koukl. Now, Greg Koukl's book is all about equipping Christians with the skills to be able to have discussions about our beliefs and our worldview in, I suppose, in a winsome way, in a diplomatic way, and in an intelligent way. And I suppose he'll speak for himself as we start giving a lot of these quotes from the book. So I was really impressed with this book once I started listening to it. I've had a very busy schedule as of late, and so I listened to this one through Audible. What's really cool about Audible is, in a lot of the cases, particularly with the Christian books, is you hear Audible through the voice of the author. And in Greg Koukl's case, he has a really cool voice. So I really enjoyed getting to hear this book read to me by Greg Koukl. So thank you, Greg Koukl, for reading this book to me. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. So chapter 1, it starts off with this question: diplomacy or D-Day? And I'm kind of paraphrasing this quote here, again, because I listened to it, not just read it visually. If either party gets mad, you lose, is something Greg Koukl mentioned in this chapter. Essentially, when you think about talking, whether it be with an atheist or someone that holds to a cult view, an unorthodox view of Christianity, they're being swept up in a false teaching of some kind, and you're trying to talk to them about that. If you get them angry, you lose. If they get you angry, you lose, because you are not going to win them over to see the truth if you are upsetting them, if you've offended them. Likewise, if they get you to lose your cool and lose your self-control, how likely are you to be able to convince them of what you're trying to convince them anyways? So we come here in chapter 2. He states kind of his aim for giving these tactics to Christians and for equipping them with that. It's titled A Modest Goal. He writes, "My aim is never to win someone to Christ." Really shocking thing to say in a Christian book. "I have a more modest goal," he writes, "one you might consider adopting as your own. All I want to do is put a stone in someone's shoe. I want to give that person something worth thinking about, something he can't ignore because it continues to poke at him in a good way," end quote. This is from page 46. So here Koukl's about to explain why he takes this more long-term marathon approach, and particularly with your family members and your co-workers that you see on a long-term basis. I can really see the benefit of having this patient approach. He's talking about getting them into either thought-provoking questions or getting them to consider something that keeps them thinking about it, and not necessarily a very aggressive cornering them to accept Jesus or don't, or but getting them thinking about something and be like, wow, that really stuck with me. And that's what he's saying his modest goal is, if I can paraphrase that. He says, "I am convinced that most Christians, including me, are not harvesters. Instead, we are ordinary gardeners tending the field so that others can bring in the crop in due season," end quote, page 48. So a lot of his language here is referencing John chapter 4. Jesus ministers to the woman at the well, and then the disciples show up with food, and he says the fields are ripe for harvest. And he's talking about the people of Sychar, hungry for the gospel, hungry to hear the word, hungry for a savior, and they're ready to give their hearts and souls to Jesus. And so they're ready to be harvested. Where others, where Koukl's saying is, you're more likely going to meet people in a gardening season that you're more likely going to sow some seed in their direction. You're more likely going to garden and put something along the way that maybe one day someone will harvest that, and God will use them to lead that person to the Lord, or help them take that final step in whatever that looks like. But he's saying the majority of us are more likely gardeners. And I see a lot of wisdom here. I see a lot of wisdom here because I think a lot of Christians put too much pressure on themselves. Like, to be an evangelist, to be an apologist, I need to be like having all these sinners' prayers with people regularly. I need to be going out in the streets and people are just breaking down and saying, I want to give my life to Jesus, and you need to have these moments to be a real Christian or a real evangelist. And I think what Greg Koukl is saying is that's not a realistic expectation for you to have on yourselves. Maybe there's some people that are really gifted. You know, when you think of great evangelists that preach the gospel and there was tons of conversions, or when you think about Peter preaching at Pentecost, and we need to be careful to ask ourselves, is that the norm? Is that the norm, though? Is that the calling for the average Christian? And what does it look like for the average Christian day to day, just being faithful? The primary tactic that he has, that he would have us do, is called the Columbo tactic. He coins this name off of an old detective cop show, I believe, long before my time. Sorry, Koukl. But basically, the detective would come onto the scene and he would ask tons of questions, kind of plain dumb, so to speak. And what he's trying to do here is to coach Christians to use this tactic of just asking questions, showing a very curious and inquiring mind when you're in these discussions with non-believers, when you're in these discussions with people in cult groups and so forth, and differing worldviews, to move the conversation in a way that advances it towards your beliefs by simply asking questions. I'll have him word it. Let's go to the quote. This is off page 60. Sometimes I simply want to gather information. Other times I want a question to reverse the burden of proof. We'll talk about that. To encourage the other person to give the reasons for his views, or hers, sorry. Finally, I use questions to make a point by leading the conversation in a specific direction. End quote. So right there, what Greg Koukl said is there's 3 reasons why he uses the Columbo tactic. One, he might just need more information. You're talking with someone, let's say they have New Age beliefs and they're syncretizing them with Christianity and what's going on here, and maybe you just need more information before you just assume the worst from them. Maybe there's a lot of things you agree on and you can really build a bridge from that common ground before you talk about where there is some need for rebuke and correction by gathering information. And it's necessary to just gather information. Then he says, other times I ask a question to reverse the burden of proof. Okay? He defines that as this: the burden of proof is the responsibility someone in the conversation has to give evidence for views. That's page 71. So essentially someone makes a truth claim. I think all Christians are hypocrites. I believe all Christians are called to have blind faith, or I believe all Christians are prejudicial and bigoted. Okay, can you help me to understand why you believe that? Can you tell me how you came to that conclusion? Is a question he's about to tell us next. So that's one of the Columbo primary ones he suggests. Can you tell me how you came to that conclusion? And now, because they have made this claim, the burden of proof is now on them. You are not in the hot seat because you're not the one spouting claims. And so as you get them to talk about their worldview and give information, now they are kind of on the witness stand. And you can now force them, so to speak, to, don't want to make that sound overly aggressive, but now you have the ability to force them to defend their view because they're the one that have put forth their view or their statement. Okay? Let's see here. The other thing he says, finally, I use questions to make a point by leading the question in a specific direction. So I used to be a wrestler and a wrestling coach, and a lot of times if you wanted to shoot a single leg on your opponent's right leg, you would move them based on how you were tied up, upper body wise, you would move them to take a step, and then you would shoot your takedown, or vice versa. You want to shoot a single leg takedown on their left leg, you need to get them to move their left leg, and you would move your body, and you would use their leverage to get that left leg to come forward. Boom, there's your takedown. And essentially, that's that final piece that Kokel's talking about, is use your questions to make a point by leading the conversation in a specific direction. He says, the Columbo tactic is a disarming way to go on the offensive, which with carefully selected questions that productively advance the conversation, end quote. That's page 62. Another primary question, or another foundational question that Kokel suggests is, what do you mean by that? So that's really helpful, particularly in this day and age where you could see how there's a definition, there's a war on definitions right now. You know, there's hijacking of terms and definitions. And so, again, it's vital in these conversations with unbelievers and people that hold to cults and false teachings that you're trying to understand and sift through this opposition of worldview is what do they mean by that? When you say you believe in Jesus, well, who do you understand Jesus to be? You say you believe in the gospel. What do you mean by the gospel? You say everyone should be anti-racist. What do you mean by anti-racism? You espouse love is love. Okay, well, help me understand what do you mean by love is love? And so as the person on the opposite side of you is making these claims or spouting their beliefs, get them to understand, get them to explain to you what they mean by those terms, then you're able to have a far more productive conversation, or have a better chance of winning this debate if it's in a more formal setting, having established what they mean by those terms they're using. We already talked about this question. How did you come to that conclusion? Okay. Then we have this quote. It says, if it gets off direction or a question is avoided, narrate the debate. So here's another tactic. Narrate the debate. Before we move on to a new topic, would it be okay with you if we finish the old one? I'm really interested in your response, end quote. So, there's the idea, there's this tactic that Kokel gives here, narrating the debate. So if I'm understanding that you believe this because of this, and therefore you don't do this. Am I understanding that correctly? And so there's the narrating the debate down there. And essentially you get them to kind of check that, yes, I'm right about that. Yes, I'm right about that. Yes, I'm right about that. Okay, therefore you should also believe this. And then he's also suggesting you have this very diplomatic phrase if they've essentially avoided your question. Okay, so if you believe that, then why don't you believe this? And then they go on a long rabbit trail, tangent, and don't answer your question. Would it be okay with you if we finish the old, before we move on to a new topic, would it be okay with you if we finish the old one? I'm really interested in your response. You can see how diplomatically worded that is. That's really intelligent. That's off page 94 if I didn't mention it earlier. Then we come to this one here. Here's a quote from page 114. If someone's thinking is flawed, the key to finding the error is to listen carefully to the reasons and then ask yourself if the conclusion follows from the evidence. Point out errors by using questions rather than statements. Have you considered? Or, can you clear this up for me? End quote. So again, look how the questions are diplomatic. So you could point out the error in the logic with the have you considered. Have you considered what would be the ramifications of this view in the police force? Have you considered what would be the ramifications of crime and safety in a city if we defunded the police? So you can see how that is not a blanket statement that is as invasive or as aggressive, where essentially the person you're speaking with now feels like they're being preached to. It's simply a question where, again, they now have the responsibility of answering and giving a realistic response to. This one says on page 120. So what Coco will say is most people today, even though most people do not hold to a biblical worldview in our country, most people have a favorable view of Jesus of Nazareth. So even if they're Buddhist, even if they're Muslim, even if they are atheist and simply believe Jesus was a good moral teacher, most people have a positive view of Jesus. Very few will simply say that they outright hate Jesus or they despise Jesus. Most people try to get Jesus on their side by fitting him into their worldview and trying to sprinkle Jesus on there. New Agers will try to recreate Jesus in their image and have a New Age Jesus. Like I said, atheists will try to use his moralistic teaching. Islam tries to hold him in high esteem as a good prophet. And so here's a question that Greg Koukl said that it's often effective to ask because of that. What do you think Jesus would have to say about your statement? So even if you want to add even a little more diplomacy to that, may I ask you a question? What do you think Jesus would think about your statement? What do you think Jesus would think about your stance? I think that's really smart. A nominal Catholic, a Sunday, quote unquote Sunday Christian. What do you think Jesus would think of your statement? A progressive Christian, moving away from the authority of Scripture. What do you think Jesus would think of your statement? Powerful. I think that's really smart, just given that insight. We move on to some other tactics as the book finishes off. Again, it seems like the primary tactic that Greg Koukl suggests is the Columbo tactic. So you are asking questions in this discussion with someone else from an opposing worldview, gather information. 2, you're asking questions to reverse the burden of proof. Say it's someone that holds to evolution and they think you're ridiculous for believing in an ark and 6-day creation model. Tell me how you believe things were created. Well, I believe in the Big Bang, and can you tell me some evidence for the Big Bang? Can you show me how evolution is observable? How we can see how we get from point A to point B with evolution. Have you ever seen anything evolve, or have you just simply heard about it? So essentially, as they spout their worldview, now the burden of proof is now reversed. Now they have to defend it. They are on the witness stand. And then finally, asking questions to lead the conversation in the direction you want it to go. Oftentimes, it sounds similar to what I've heard about being pigeonholed in a debate, but it sounds less aggressive, I guess. It sounds less aggressive than what's been described in competitive debate. But now we move on, and he's going to describe some other tactics outside of simply the Columbo tactic. He calls this one the suicide tactic. He says, suicidal views have within them the seeds of this. I can't read my handwriting here. The suicidal views have within them the seeds of their own destruction because they express contradictory concepts. End quote, page 156. So essentially, someone is talking with you and they're challenging your Christian worldview, and you get them to talk with your Columbo tactic, with your questions, and you start to see that within their worldview, their views contradict each other. That's what Greg Koukl would call the suicide tactic. You've gathered enough information to see, actually, you espouse this, you say you believe in the value of life, and that's why you're against the death penalty, and you're advocate for these animal rights, yet you're also telling me that a woman should have the right to choose whether or not to have her baby ripped to pieces. Okay. And so you could see the contradictory views here. One, you can't kill this endangered bird. This is utterly immoral, but a woman does have the right to kill her baby up to 9 months outside. You could show that this is the suicide tactic. This is contradictory views. Excuse me. In chapter 11, he gives this tactic called the practical suicide. Some points of view fail the pragmatic test, and so they simply can't work in real life application. I think the defund the police one might work that I was thinking of earlier, but essentially you get them to talk about their viewpoint, and you can nod your head like, okay, then let's see how would that play out in this marriage. Okay, so as a feminist or as an egalitarian, you believe that there should be no roles in the home and there should be no leadership. The husband shouldn't be the head. Okay, well, how do you make decisions in conflict? Do you simply flip a coin? Do you have constant mediation in every conflict? If you're using this Ephesians 5:21 of submit one to another and applying that to marriage, how do you decide whose turn it is to submit? Is it her turn this week and his turn that week? Help me to understand how this looks practically. And so essentially the practical suicide is seeing that their view doesn't work practically, and getting them to have to verbalize that out loud forces them to see the lack of practicability in their view. Sibling rivalry. I'm not so sure how this one's different from the suicide tactic. And same thing as we go on to taking the roof off. These two, I would like to hear more from him in some of the interviews. So I've watched a lot of the interviews, whether he's been on Alyssa Childers' podcast, whether he's been on speaking with Natasha Crane or Melissa Doherty. He mostly talks about the Columbo tactic, which is his bread and butter. But I would like to hear how the suicide tactic and the sibling rivalry are different. And same thing with the taking the roof off. But we'll talk about the quotes here. Sibling rivalry. Sometimes objections come in pairs that are logically inconsistent with each other. What comes to my mind is probably within intersectionality, and that, women over here in the oppressed category and transgender over here in this category as oppressed, yet we can see, when we're looking over here in this women's sport, it would appear this transgender just broke the skull of this biological female in this MMA fight, and it doesn't appear that they were both oppressed. It seems like one used political agenda to get themselves an advantage in a sport and actually harmed a woman seriously in the process. So you could see how you're trying to hold to something that isn't compatible with the other. But I would like a little more differentiation on how it's different from the suicide tactic. This one he called taking the roof off. He says, technique designed to show that some views prove too much if taken seriously. They lead to counterintuitive or even absurd results, end quote, page 191. And then this one, this was more of a defensive tactic. And so he's talking about, what if you get someone that they're just being rude, they're being really aggressive, they won't let you speak. And I thought this sounded really wise and logical. He says, he coined this or titled this the steamroller. It said, step 1, stop the interruption graciously but firmly. Then briefly negotiate an agreement. Step 2, shame him by making a direct request for courtesy. And step 3, leave. End quote, page 201. So think about, excuse me. You can see the firmness. I was hoping that we could have a civil and respectful conversation. Would you be willing to have a civil and respectful conversation? To me, that how I understand is we're not going to raise our voices at each other or condescend one another or interrupt one another. We're actually going to let each other finish each other's thoughts. Would you be willing to continue our conversation under those guidelines? No? Okay. Well, I'm sorry you feel that way, but unfortunately, out of respect for myself, I'm going to have to step out now. Or, wonderful, I'm glad that we can agree to that. I believe that's what it would look like trying to put that into action. So I think that sounds really smart, really diplomatic. Stop the interruption graciously yet firmly. Then briefly negotiate an agreement. Step 2, shame them by making a direct request for courtesy. And then step 3, leave. And I think that's really smart, because there was another part in the book where Coco was talking about a lot of times you're not necessarily going to win. You might not necessarily win over the person you're in this debate with, you're in this conflict or disagreement with, but there's people watching, there's people listening. And this winsome language, this diplomatic language might change their hearts of the people listening. And it might also be a good Christ-like witness to them, because you didn't sin in your anger, because you didn't give in to your anger. You witness to them, the listeners around. So whether that's in your commenting in some sort of public conversation on social media, or whether you're just you're in the employee lounge and you're talking with someone and there's people pouring their coffee, there's people getting their lunch and they can hear this, or at a family gathering. And so you need to think just past just the you and them. There's people listening. And so you're exposing their logical fallacies. You're exposing the lack of credibility in their own unbiblical worldview. And you're showing a lot of insecurity on their part for having to be that aggressive, for being the steamroller, as mentioned here in page 201. Pushback that I would have for this book is, I suppose, and one way of looking at it, using the phrase the burden of proof that Greg Koukl talks about, I think there's a bit of burden of proof on his part, as far as how do we know this in the long run is effective? Because it seems to me that this is what is being suggested as a better long-term way of going about apologetics and evangelism. Is there fruit that we can look at from the long term to see that? Are there testimonies? So this is a 10th anniversary edition that's out in stores right now, and that's being promoted in interviews on podcasts. If there were ever a 20th anniversary edition, what I might suggest as a satisfied reader would be maybe if you added some testimonies in there of how people have benefited from this, or by both using this and being saved from some of these discussions in the long term. And so maybe you could have some testimonies on a future book, or just add it into a future presentation at a apologetics conference. And here are some testimonials. After 20 years, this person finally gave their life to the Lord, and here are some stones in their shoes that people used along the way, on how people use the Columbo tactic, and God used these people use them to call this person to him and draw this person to him. And here's some people that God put in their lives along their way and just put a stone up in their shoe, that use that Columbo tactic, getting them thinking about the truth of the gospel. I think that could be really powerful to show, because I believe what Greg Koukl is saying. I believe in what tactics is saying, but the skeptic might not. The person shy and looking for an excuse not to get into these evangelistic conversations, or feeling that they're just looking for an excuse out of being an apologist and that calling to defend and contend for the faith. They might be looking for excuse to think, I don't even know if that works though. It sounds really smart, sounds really wise and logical. I think having some testimonials added to the book or the presentation could be really powerful, of just saying, hey, and here's these different people that I use tactics on, and then here's 10 years later, now they're pastoring. And here's 10 years later, they're off drugs and Jesus got a hold of their life. And they point back in their testimony to when I used this Columbo tactic, when I used the suicide tactic, and they started to see the error in their ways. And granted, they weren't led to the Lord in that moment, but it's a part of their testimony. You know, maybe a couple of years down the road, that God used that within their testimony to draw them to him. And I think a few testimonies like that added to the book, added to this presentation of tactics, could really go a long way. Because granted, we shouldn't prioritize pragmatics over Scripture. Far be it. We shouldn't make pragmatics the end all. But if something doesn't work, we shouldn't do it either. That's very unwise. It's not shrewd. It's not having good tactics. So I do think this is effective, but I think just sprinkling in a little evidences here of its long-term effects, of its long-term success, could really go a long way. And I feel like there was one other thing at the top of my head. But overall, at the end, this is probably more a me thing. Greg Koukl talked about when you're evangelizing, you're in these discussions with people, this is one of the later ending chapters, to avoid overly biblical language, to avoid Christianese. I read it and it really rubbed me the wrong way. It reminded me of something Andy Stanley said in one of his books, I think like Far and Wide or something, to stop saying the Bible says or God says and so forth, but to say the Apostle Paul said this or Jesus said that. And I think the authority of Scripture can go a long way. And I'd be careful in throwing that out the way Andy Stanley suggests. And it sounded that Koukl was saying a similar thing. Not that I'm trying to put them in the same box by any stretch of the imagination. Greg Koukl stands firmly on the truth of the word and the truth of the gospel. But so maybe that's just my own getting triggered hearing something similar, where I'd heard Andy Stanley say something like that. Hey, let's throw out all the this Christian terminology that could be hindering people and building a barrier between people. And so I would just caution, we don't want to be overly complicated. We don't want to be overly academic and throw out propitiation and predestination, all these big eschatology and pneumatology, all these big words. But we also need to be careful when we're dumbing down the message of the gospel in a place that have we diluted it. So maybe being careful with that. But maybe it's a chapter that I need to give another read to and make sure I'm understanding the guidance there well. Overall, I think everyone should read this book. I think every Christian can benefit from this book to enhance our ability to have conversations. I think if anything, what this political season around COVID and that political election year and everything really showed is we don't know how to have conversations anymore. We don't know how to have diplomatic and respectful conversations with people that just believe different stuff than us. And I think tactics would really benefit people in just having conversations with their coworkers, having conversations with people with different political beliefs, having conversations with people of different worldviews, and doing it in a Christ-like manner and doing it in an effective manner with the long term in view. Some of the examples or some of the pictures that I thought of, what I thought of as I read this book, I thought of, me and my wife, we watched a UFC fight once. We were driving through from Colorado to California. We stopped in Arizona and watched this fight, and there was a kickboxer. And for the first 2 rounds, he basically just leg kicked the girl she was fighting. Low leg kick, boom, low leg kick, boom. And then the 4th round comes, and because of all those leg kicks and all those kicks to the body, the fighter dropped her hands and had her hands down here. When she saw the leg moving, the fighter went high, went head kick, highlight reel, head kick, KO. And we just don't have the patience for that. We want to win the argument right there and have them have some kind of unrealistic moment where they're just like, wow, you're just so much smarter than I am. I need to just throw my political party out the door. I need to just convert to Christianity right now. And we need to be more realistic than that. What you saw in that MMA fight was a gradual setup until boom, things were ready. And that's the patience of a 25-minute MMA fight. It didn't go the full 25, but it was going a long time, a lot longer than most viewers have ever fought. It was a lot of patience. How much more patience do we need with the people we see on a daily basis? You're in the long game with them. Do not push them away by being excessively aggressive. Oh, that was the other pushback. Is I would ask Mr. Kokel, Dr. Kokel, but what about people that you're probably never going to see them again? Maybe you have an interaction with them. Maybe you're on an airplane ride. Maybe you're just passing through, and maybe it's a family member and they're terminally ill. Is there a place for being more aggressive? Is there a place for having more urgency because you're not going to see them ever again? That'd just be a question of mine. Or would you simply trust in the sovereignty of God that he'll send someone else or so forth? I don't know. But as far as family members, coworkers, people you see on a daily or a regular basis, I could see how tactics, the Columbo tactic, this diplomacy that Ray Kokel teaches in the book is going to be a far better way of interacting with those you love and far more wise and intelligent way of trying to show people the validity within the Christian worldview opposed to the worldview that they hold to. So, do I think people should get this book? Absolutely. I think any Christian should get it. And I think anyone just that talks to people regularly with differing worldviews, anyone that struggles with there's people in your life you love, but you just can't talk to them because it's always a fight. It's always an argument. It always ends in some kind of conflict, and you have bad family gatherings. Tactics would really equip you to being able to have less toxic interactions with people and more productive conversations. So that's the book Tactics by Greg Kokel. It was a real blessing for me to hear on Audible. Hopefully I'll have a less busy schedule in the future with more page reading. But thank you for tuning in. If this channel has been a blessing to you, if this ministry has been a blessing to you, please share the video that's been most impactful to you. Leave a comment. It helps generate more appearances in the algorithm, even if it's pushback, even if it's disagreements or just a question. And then hit subscribe, please. So thank you for tuning in. I look forward to doing some more videos coming up soon. And thanks again for your time.